outreach to Latinos. President Trump keynotes a meeting of Hispanic leaders. We have his remarks. Another departure. Reaction after the White House's top economic advisor announces he's leaving. November preview. Texas holds the country's first primaries. We'll tell you how pro-life candidates fared. And future saint. Pope Francis clears the way for the canonization of Archbishop Oscar Romero. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, March 7th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. President Trump is selling Hispanic business owners on his new tax cuts. He delivered the keynote address at the annual legislative summit of the Latino Coalition. It's his first time addressing this group, and Catholics are weighing in. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The president told Latino business owners today they'll see more benefits from his tax cuts in the coming weeks. I spoke with Catholics in attendance who are pleased the president is trying to reach out to a growing Latino population in the U.S., but they are concerned some of his policies aren't putting families first.
A lot of the people in this room are making America great again.
President Trump says his cuts on taxes and regulation have helped Latinos in business to thrive.
Latino-owned businesses now make up more than 10% of all businesses in the United States, providing jobs for more than 2 million American workers.
We are seen as the contributors of the economy of the country.
Cedia Lichi is a small business owner and a Catholic. She praised President Trump for acknowledging Latinos.
In the technology, in the infrastructure, small business, Latinas entrepreneurs, I think we have a lot to give to the country.
The Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate reports approximately 30.4 million Latino Catholics live in the U.S. Texas-based business owner J.R. Gonzalez is concerned the president's policies don't acknowledge the changing face of America as the number of Latinos in the U.S. grows.
Let's just take DACA, for example. Most of them are working, they're in the military, they're students. This is the next generation. This is the next generation of minds. This is the face of the country. And that face is not white, it's brown.
In October, the president ended DACA and gave Congress the responsibility to come up with a solution.
And we're trying to have a DACA victory for everybody, by the way, and the Democrats are nowhere to be found. They're nowhere to be found.
Gonzalez wants the president to support citizenship for DACA recipients, known as Dreamers, separate from efforts to expand border security. His Catholic faith is inspiring him to share a reminder with a president known for his background in business.
The factor that the president is not putting in is the human factor. It's like these are people. They're not bargaining chips. They're not playing cards that you can go in and cut a deal with. It's always not about the deal. It's about human beings. It's about being a Christian nation.
Lauren, I spoke with a White House official today who reaffirmed the president will only support immigration legislation that offers citizenship to 1.8 million Dreamers if it includes greater border security, and that, of course, includes a wall. Lauren.
White House correspondent Mark Irons, thank you. Jared Kushner is heading to Mexico to meet with President Enrique Peña Nieto. The president's senior advisor and son-in-law is with staff from the State Department and National Security Council. On the agenda, trade, security, and immigration. President Trump's top economic advisor is leaving the White House. Gary Cohn is the director of the National Economic Council. He disagreed with and tried to change the president's plan to impose tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. President Trump praised Cohn, saying his advisor served his country with great distinction. The Senate moves closer to passing a bill relaxing banking rules for regional banks. It revises key aspects of the Dodd-Frank law put into place after the financial crisis in 2008. Supporters say it will boost the economy.
This bill is not about regulatory relief and tweaking some regulations. It's really about allowing a greater flow of credit in our communities. It's about making sure we have economic growth, that we have jobs.
Opponents of the bill say it's the work of lobbyists who want to help big banks. The measure is co-sponsored by 13 Republicans and 13 Democrats or independents. Women win big, and Democrats turn out in record numbers in the nation's first primary of the year, where pro-life issues are front and center. The Texas election could be a harbinger of what's ahead for this year's midterms. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. Energized and angry Democrats in Texas came out in force. They're hoping to turn that energy into big wins in the fall. But it will be a tough fight in a state where the GOP has dominated for decades.
Democrats top 1 million votes for the first time in a Texas midterm primary since 2002. Congressman Beto O'Rourke supports abortion and the banning of AR-15 style assault rifles. He's challenging Republican Senator Ted Cruz, a strong defender of religious freedom and the unborn.
People are getting off the sidelines and into the game. And our strategy of going to each one of the 254 counties, listening to people and making their concerns and their fight, our concerns and our fight, is going to work.
Texas Republicans also set a new benchmark for turnout in midterm elections. 85%, or 1.3 million, voted for Cruz.
Congressman O'Rourke is running hard to the left. He is embracing positions like open borders, like amnesty.
But with Democrats topping recent state party records in turnout, I asked Texas's senior senator if he's worried.
Democrats saw a doubling of voters last night, 1 million voters. How worried are you about the midterms?
Well, I think it's a wake-up call for Republicans in Texas. We need to, but also the White House. We need to get people out to vote in November. I'm confident we will.
Texas Alliance for Life says abortion is a key issue in Texas.
It will be a matchup on statewide races between a pro-life Republican and a pro-abortion Democrat. In all likelihood, the Republicans will win because Texas is a pro-life state. But Republicans have to be vigilant.
Catholic Governor Greg Abbott will face one of 2 Democratic challengers, including Andrew White. White calls himself pro-life, but says he'll veto bills limiting abortion. Democrats also hope to flip 3 GOP congressional seats in the state districts that voted for Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. Now, President Trump won Texas by 9 points in 2016. That's the smallest margin for a Republican in 20 years.
Jason,
Lauren?
Tell us about women in this Texas election. It looked like they came out in spades.
That's right. 50 women ran for Congress in the state. More than half of them won their primaries or advanced to runoffs, and also many women running for the State House, including Cynthia Flores. She's a Catholic mother and also pro-life, and she won her nomination to become a state rep.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. The Trump administration files a lawsuit against California. Attorney General Jeff Sessions says he wants to block laws in the state that extend protections to people living in the U.S. illegally.
We're simply asking the state and other sanctuary jurisdictions to stop actively obstructing federal law enforcement.
The suit targets sanctuary policies that do not enforce federal immigration law. Sessions also slams California lawmakers, saying they promote radical agendas and open borders. State officials remain defiant. One responds, quote, "Bring it on." South Korea's president says a rare summit with North Korea will not mean an easing of international sanctions. President Moon Jae-in plans to meet with a delegation from North Korea this month. His national security director will brief American officials this week in Washington on recently completed talks between the North and the South. World leaders want North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, and the U.S. is cautiously optimistic about negotiations. Syrian government forces carry out airstrikes against a rebel-held suburb of Damascus. The UN is urging all parties to implement a ceasefire of at least 30 days. It called for the truce late last month, but the attacks have continued. More than 100 were killed on Monday. The majority Catholic nation of East Timor reaches a historic agreement with Australia over billions of dollars in natural resources. The countries negotiated a boundary in the Timor Sea, which is rich in oil and gas. The treaty is very good news for East Timor, one of the poorest nations in the world. It will receive at least 70% of the revenue. In another majority Catholic country, more than 70 Argentinian lawmakers present a bill to legalize elective abortion in the first 14 weeks of pregnancy. Currently, it is permitted only in cases of rape or if the mother's health is in danger. A court in England upholds a decision to take a 21-month-old off of life support. The parents of Alfie Evans wanted him to continue to receive treatment for an undiagnosed degenerative condition. They hoped he would be transferred to a hospital in Rome associated with the Vatican. The toddler is in a semi-vegetative state. His doctors say further treatment is, quote, futile. The Holy Father reaches out to the victims of last week's earthquake in Papua New Guinea. The 7.5 magnitude quake killed at least 55 people, and the country is suffering from strong aftershocks. The Vatican Secretary of State writes, commending the souls of the deceased to the mercy of Almighty God, Pope Francis sends his heartfelt condolences to their families, and he assures all those affected by this disaster of his closeness in prayer. Pope Francis has cleared the way for Archbishop Oscar Romero to be made a saint. The Holy Father approved a miracle attributed to Romero's intercession yesterday. The Salvadoran was gunned down by a right-wing death squad in 1980 as he celebrated Mass. Romero was beatified in El Salvador in 2015. Vatican correspondent Juliette Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliette, who was Archbishop Romero? Why did he make headlines during his lifetime?
He was a churchman who stood up for the poor. Now, during El Salvador's military dictatorship, he preached against the oppression of the underprivileged. And he was actually shot in 1980 as he was saying Mass in a hospital chapel by right-wing gunmen. Now, the right wing didn't approve of him. They saw him as an ally of the left, specifically because he preached against the oppression of the poor during the Civil War. Now, as you remember, the Civil War in El Salvador ran between 1980 and 1992.
His cause for sainthood was put on hold for years, even though he was gunned down. Why was that?
Indeed, it was put on hold because some within the church saw him as being sympathetic to the liberation theology movement. Now, that is a movement that in its extreme promotes a Marxist interpretation of the gospel, Lauren. So in other words, that Jesus is a political revolutionary who is seeking to overthrow the oppressors of the poor. Now, Pope Francis, nevertheless, in 2015 declared him a martyr, so that would be somebody who dies due to hatred of his faith. And hundreds of thousands of Salvadorians were overjoyed by this news because they see him, they hold him up as a model of peace and forgiveness in their country.
Pope Francis also cleared another miracle yesterday. Tell us about that.
Yes, he approved a miracle attributed to Paul VI. So that removes yet another obstacle on Paul VI's path to canonization and sainthood. Now, it's widely expected here at the Vatican that his canonization will take place in October at the end of the Bishop Synod, which is a meeting that he himself established in 1965.
Thank you so much, Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent.
Thank you, Lauren.
A court in Australia held a hearing yesterday to decide if there's enough evidence to warrant a trial against Cardinal George Pell. The top Vatican official is not on trial, as we reported yesterday, but is accused of sexual abuse decades ago. The cardinal denies any wrongdoing. Coming up, building bridges, Pope Francis on the Olympics. Plus, chaos at the White House? We put the question to a media analyst. The governor of Mississippi says he'll sign a bill to ban abortions after 15 weeks. The state Senate voted yesterday to pass the bill. Once final approval is made in the House, it will be sent to Governor Phil Bryant. The law would set the earliest abortion ban in the United States. Taking another look at the Texas primaries now. A familiar Republican name won big last night. Bush. George P. Bush is now the Texas State Land Commissioner. He's the son of Jeb Bush, former governor of Florida, and the nephew of former President George W. Bush. To talk politics tonight, Vince Cullinase, editorial director at the Daily Caller, host of Mornings on the Mall on WMAL Radio. Nice to have you.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So George P. Bush, I first heard his name in 2000 when all the girls were going crazy over him at the Republican convention in Philadelphia. Many people were speculating that if George lost, the Bush dynasty would be completely done. Are we going to see, do you think, George P. on another ballot anytime?
Well, I'm not sure if we can equate getting a second term as land commissioner in the state of Texas as a continuation of the Bush dynasty. I imagine George P. Bush might hope that that's the case. I do think that in terms of political family dynasties, we just saw the Clintons lose again. And the idea of having the Bushes back in office right now, there's not a lot of appetite to sustain political dynasties in the United States. So he's going to have to put that one on hold for a while. It is a surprise to see him win. He was facing a tough challenge, actually, in that primary race. He pulled it off, and I think that there were a lot of very interesting lessons for both political parties in Texas.
Well, he's Latino and he is Catholic. Texas Democrats came out big last night for this primary. They seem to be very energized. Do you think that Democrats could take over Republicans coming up in the midterms?
Well, Democrats are certainly hoping so. Texas is an interesting state because Democrats see this as a bellwether, and also the notion that maybe, just maybe, Texas could go blue in the future. It's demographically trending that way. You have the Latino population exploding in Texas, and Democrats see good signs in that. Here's the thing to look out for, though. Many Democrats who voted in yesterday's primaries were people who already traditionally vote. There wasn't a huge tranche of new voters, and Democrats are leaving that race yesterday a little concerned that they're not turning out the people that they want to.
Earlier in the show, we heard from a pro-life Texas group that said abortion is the issue that is front and center in Texas. Should the GOP be worried that abortion is going to drive the Democrats' message, hence potentially driving more Democrats to the polls?
Well, I think the politicians, by and large, should run on what they believe in. So I think to the extent that Republicans and Democrats think about abortion, they should allow those convictions to guide what their messages are and hope people show up for those reasons. Republicans do have to realize, like, so long as they're in power, just like if the Democrats were in power, they are going to face an insurgent threat from people who are out of power. That always happens, and that's why Democrats are expecting a good year. Will it be good enough to take back the House? I don't think that's yet told.
Speaking of the House, let's move on to the White House. Chaos, yes, no. Gary Cohn left. We heard that earlier in the show. People are calling it the brain drain. Does this give more credence to that chaos theory?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen quite a few people leave it was an inordinate amount, actually, who've left the White House, a lot of the top players in the Trump White House. But I think ultimately, what you're going to see, no matter what year it is, no matter what phase of the Trump presidency is, you will see conflict in the White House. You will see people who disagree with one another. Gary Cohn and Peter Navarro, two guys who were economic advisors to the President of the United States, had very different ideas about what they think the U.S. trade policy should be.
And
they've been there
Gary Cohn lost
throughout, and they've been fighting. Yes, well, Gary Cohn lost on that fight, but he successfully was able to usher through tax reform inside of that White House. They felt like that was an accomplishment, and he feels like he's leaving there with a good report card. Gary Cohn wasn't expected to last more than a year anyway, by his own admission. So he made it to this point. We'll see what happens next.
Thank you so much. Vince Colonnese, editorial director at the Daily Caller.
Thank you.
Athletes arrive in South Korea for this year's Paralympics. North Koreans will be taking part in the Games. You'll see they were processed through customs. Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, will lead the U.S. delegation. The Games start on Friday. Pope Francis is praising those athletes as examples of courage.
La messa non si paga.
The Holy Father also says last month's Olympics Games showed sports can build bridges and give a valid contribution to peace. He made the remarks today during his general audience. Pope Francis is praying for peace and joy for all of the participants. The Archbishop of Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam dies while in Rome. Paul Boy Van Duck suffered a stroke just a day after meeting with Pope Francis. He was in Rome on pilgrimage with other Vietnamese church leaders. The Archbishop has led Ho Chi Minh City since 2014. He was 73 years old. Up next, Christian persecution, the situation for the faithful in Iraq. And what a picture! Former First Lady and a young fan. Christians in Iraq are still facing dire circumstances. In Mosul, the bodies of 40 Christians have been discovered in a mass grave. Many of the women and children were buried with small crosses. According to Iraqi News, ISIS is responsible. A little over a decade ago, there were more than 1 million Christians in Iraq. Now that number is about 200,000. Let's talk about why. Joining us now is Zina Kyriakos, president of the Iraqi Christian Human Rights Council. She's a Chaldean-American attorney advocating for Christians in the region. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
I hope I said that name right.
Yes,
Kyriakos.
perfectly.
Good. Perfect. Open Doors, another organization helping Christians there, says that there are still 60 people missing from the Nineveh Plains from when ISIS came in. Now we're finding this mass grave, and we understand that ISIS is responsible for that. I thought ISIS was pretty much out of Iraq. What's happening?
Well, there are still elements of ISIS in Iraq, and the Iraqi forces, along with the coalition troops to defeat ISIS, are trying to find the elements and eliminate them. But there are still elements there.
Are those incidents related, do you think?
Between the missing Christians and the graves? Yes. When ISIS came in 2014 and took over Mosul and then also the Nineveh Plains, where a majority of the Chaldean and Syriac Christian towns are in Iraq, they kidnapped over 100 Christians during that process. And so we believe that the mass grave of 40 Christians that were just found are part of that over 100 Christians that were kidnapped.
In September, the UN established a group to basically, let's sentence ISIS and to bring them to trial for their crimes first. How much of a role do you think that Iraqi Christians are going to be able to play in this process of taking these leaders who have committed mass murder to trial?
Well, it's going to be an uphill battle, I believe, with the UN for Iraqi Christians to be involved in the process, but we are definitely going to continue to fight for our rights to be in the process. So far, the UN has not been very open to the issue of Christian genocide in Iraq. They have focused some attention on the Yazidi genocide, which is a very noble thing for them to do, but so far they have not responded to our request to be part of the process.
The UN, however, is no stranger to war crimes, and in Bosnia, for example, they brought Bosnian Serbs to trial and convicted many of them. So, in their genocide of the Bosnian Muslims. So, there hasn't been much support for Iraqi Christians. Do you know why the UN isn't getting back to you?
My best guess is political correctness. There is a apprehension to focus on the issue of Christian persecution in the Middle East by the Muslim majority, and this persecution has been going on for Iraqi Christians for the last 15 years. We have been going through a genocide. We've had bishops kidnapped and murdered, priests, nuns. Over 100 Christians, as I mentioned earlier, when ISIS came in, were kidnapped. So this has been ongoing, and we've had really silence from many international organizations, including the UN, about the Iraqi Christian genocide.
And what do you hope to accomplish by coming and speaking out about the lack of UN response?
Well, we want to put the UN on notice that Iraqi Christians have gone through a genocide for the last 15 years, including the ISIS genocide against Christians and Yazidis in Iraq, and we demand to be part of the process.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. Zina Kyriakos, president of the Iraqi Christian Human Rights Council.
Thank you.
And taking a look at the political situation in Iraq, Iraqis are flocking to polling stations to collect new electronic voting cards. More than 24 million voters are eligible. The elections are the country's fourth since the U.S.-led invasion toppled Saddam Hussein in 2003. Those elections take place May 12th. An expedition team finds the wreckage of the USS Lexington off the coast of Australia. Lady Lex was sunk by the Japanese during World War II. Hundreds of crew members were killed, but around 3,000 were evacuated. The expedition, funded by Microsoft founder Paul Allen, has recovered nearly a dozen of the vessel's 35 planes. They are rare aircraft, of which there are no other surviving examples. Finally tonight, when it comes to Michelle Obama, a young girl in Washington gets the big picture and then some. The former First Lady posted this video on Twitter, and it has gone viral. It's a dance party she had with this 2-year-old Parker Curry. This is a picture of her, and she is staring at the painting of Mrs. Obama. That portrait hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. Michelle's message to the tot: keep on dreaming big, and maybe one day I'll proudly look up at a portrait of you. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night and God bless.